For 17 years, trucks rolled down to the Florida coastline carrying something most people would call garbage. Not fish, not plastic, not chemical waste, just shells. Piles and piles of broken, greasy, foul-smelling oyster and clam shells, scraped off restaurant plates, shoveled out of seafood processing, plants, and swept up from steam pots across the state. Between 2007 and 2024, more than 500,000 tons of this discarded shell were hauled to the water's edge and tipped straight into the Gulf of Mexico. No blueprints, no careful arrangement, no engineered structure waiting to receive them. Just shell after shell, sinking into the dark water and settling onto a seafloor that had been sliding toward collapse for decades. At first glance, it looked like reckless dumping. Critics said as much. Environmental groups raised alarms. Even some of the scientists involved in the project privately admitted they weren't sure what would happen. Rotting shellfish remains, poured by the ton into an already stressed marine. Environment sounded less like restoration and more like an ecological gamble. For a while, nothing seemed to happen. The shells sat there, silent, unremarkable. If you had dropped a camera to the bottom of the Gulf in those early months, you would have seen little more than a gray, lifeless mound of broken shell, indistinguishable from junk. But the ocean was not idle. It was working. To understand why anyone would try something this strange, you have to understand what had already been lost. Oyster reefs were once one of the most abundant structures along the Gulf Coast. In the early 20th century, entire bays were carpeted with living reef, dense enough in places to be a hazard to boats. These reefs weren't just home to oysters. They were the scaffolding for entire ecosystems. Fish sheltered in their crevices. Crabs and shrimp used them as nurseries. Birds fed along their edges. The reefs buffered the coastline from storm surge, absorbing wave energy before it could reach the shore. Then over the course of a century, most of it disappeared. Overharvesting stripped reefs faster than oysters could rebuild them. Dredging for shipping channels tore up seafloor habitat. Pollution and runoff smothered young oysters before they could take hold. Disease outbreaks, worsened by warming waters, wiped out entire colonies. By the early 2000s, scientists estimated that the Gulf Coast had lost somewhere between 50 and 80% of its historic oyster reef, depending on the region. Some bays had lost almost all of it. Apalachicola Bay, once one of the most productive oyster fisheries in the country, saw its harvest collapse to a fraction of historic levels within a few short years. The problem with a lost reef is that it doesn't just come back on its own. Oyster larvae are picky. They drift through the water in enormous numbers, but they can only survive if they find the right kind of surface to attach to. That surface, almost always, is old oyster shell. Calcium carbonate, rough-edged and chemically familiar, sends a signal that tells baby oysters this is a safe place to settle. Without shell, the larvae drift past bare mud and sand, unable to find purchase, and die within days. It's a brutal bottleneck. A reef needs shell to grow, but a reef also produces the shell that future reefs need. Once you drop below a certain threshold, the whole system can quietly starve itself into extinction, generation after generation, without anyone noticing until the reef is simply gone. This is where the shell recycling idea came from. If the missing ingredient was surface area, calcium carbonate that baby oysters could grab onto, then the answer might be sitting in dumpsters behind every seafood restaurant in the state. Florida, like much of the Gulf Coast, produces enormous quantities of oyster and clam shell waste every single day. Restaurants shuck thousands of oysters a night. Processing plants strip shells from millions of pounds of shellfish a year. Historically, almost all of that shell went straight to a landfill. It was treated as trash, hauled away, buried, and forgotten. Marine biologists and coastal restoration groups began asking an obvious but overlooked question. What if that shell went back into the water instead of into the ground? The logic was simple, even if the execution was enormous. Partner with restaurants and processing plants, collect the shells instead of throwing them away, cure them often by leaving them exposed to open air and sunlight for months to kill off bacteria and remove lingering tissue, then load them onto barges and trucks, haul them to targeted restoration sites, and release them onto the seafloor in the exact locations where historic reefs had once stood. It wasn't glamorous work. It involved a lot of smell, a lot of logistics, and a lot of patience. But over nearly 2 decades, it added up to something extraordinary. More than 500,000 tons of recycled shell returned to Gulf waters. The first weeks after each deposit were the hardest to watch. A fresh pile of shell on the seafloor looks like exactly what it is. Debris. There's no visible life, no color, no movement beyond the sway of current. It would have been easy, standing on a boat above one of these sites, to conclude that the whole effort had failed. But underwater, at a scale invisible to the naked eye, something had already begun. Bacteria are the first to arrive. Within hours of the shell settling onto the seafloor, microbial communities begin colonizing the surface, forming a thin, slick layer known as a biofilm. This biofilm is easy to overlook, but it is the true starting point of everything that follows. It changes the chemistry of the shell's surface. It creates a texture and a scent at a microscopic level that signals to drifting larvae that this is a hospitable place to land. Algae join next, adding their own chemical cues and their own patch of surface for tiny grazing organisms to feed on. Within days, the once sterile shell pile has become something closer to a foundation, still lifeless to the eye, very much alive underneath. Then come the first true colonizers. Barnacles, notoriously indiscriminate about where they attach, cement themselves to the shell in growing clusters. Tube worms follow, building thin, calcareous casings that add yet more texture and complexity to the surface. And then, if the biofilm has done its job and the water chemistry cooperates, the larvae that the entire project was designed for begin to arrive. Baby oysters, known as spat, searching for exactly the kind of surface the recycled shells now offer in abundance. A single adult oyster can release millions of eggs in a spawning season. Only a small fraction will ever find a hospitable surface to settle on. But when hundreds of thousands of tons of clean, cured shell are sitting on the seafloor in exactly the right locations, the odds shift dramatically. Instead of drifting past bare mud, larvae encounter shell after shell after shell, an artificial abundance of exactly what they need. Settlement rates on these restored beds have, in documented cases, far outpaced what would occur naturally on unrestored, shell-starved seafloor. Once spats settle and begin to grow, the feedback loop that had been broken for a century starts to repair itself. Juvenile oysters cement themselves permanently in place and begin filtering water almost immediately. A single adult oyster can filter dozens of gallons of water a day, straining out algae, sediment, and excess nutrients as it feeds. Multiply that by the millions of new oysters settling across a restored reef, and the effect on water quality becomes significant almost immediately. Cloudy, nutrient-choked water begins to clear. Sunlight penetrates deeper, and with clearer water and more light, seagrass beds nearby often begin to expand, creating even more habitat for fish, crabs, and the small invertebrates that support the entire coastal food web. The reef, once nothing more than a mound of restaurant waste, starts to grow upward and outward. Layer builds on layer as new generations of oysters settle onto the shells of their predecessors, exactly the way natural reefs have built themselves for thousands of years. What began as a flat, gray scatter of shell transforms, over months and then years, into a three-dimensional structure with crevices, ridges, and hiding spots. And where structure appears, so does everything that depends on it. Small fish move in first, using the reef's nooks as shelter from predators. Crabs follow, drawn by both the shelter and the abundance of prey species that the reef supports. Shrimp use the structure as a nursery ground, hiding among the oyster clusters until they're large enough to venture into open water. Predatory fish arrive next, following the smaller fish that have already taken up residence. Over time, observers at these restoration sites documented a genuine trophic cascade, a rebuilding of the food web from the bottom up, all traceable back to a decision to stop throwing shell in a landfill and start putting it back in the ocean. The scale of Florida's project, sustained over nearly 2 decades, allowed researchers to track outcomes that shorter-term efforts simply can't capture. Fish populations in and around restored reef sites were documented recovering to levels not observed in over 2.5 decades. Turtle sightings increased in some areas, likely drawn by the improved habitat and prey availability. Dolphin activity, often used by researchers as an indicator of a healthy, fish-rich environment, picked up around several of the restoration zones. None of these species were reintroduced or manipulated directly. They simply returned on their own once the underlying habitat that had sustained them a century earlier was rebuilt. It's worth pausing on why this matters beyond the water itself. Healthy oyster reefs are not just an ecological curiosity, they are directly tied to human livelihoods along the Gulf Coast. Commercial and recreational fisheries depend on the nursery habitat that reefs provide. A decline in reef habitat translates, with a lag of a few years, into a decline in the fish and shellfish available to catch, fewer. Fish caught means less income for fishing communities and higher prices at the seafood counters and restaurants that depend on a steady local supply. Tourism, too, is tied to water clarity and marine life abundance. Murky, lifeless water is a harder sell to visitors than a coastline teeming with fish and clear water. There's also a more direct physical benefit. Oyster reefs act as natural breakwaters. Their hard, uneven structure absorbs and dissipates wave energy before it reaches the shoreline. Research conducted in Gulf waters has found that oyster reefs can reduce wave energy by anywhere from roughly 76 to 99%, depending on reef size and configuration. In a region facing rising seas and increasingly intense storms, and where some estimates suggest coastal land is being lost at a rate approaching a football field every 100 minutes, every reef that reduces wave impact is doing quiet, unglamorous, essential work. It's a form of coastal defense that doesn't require concrete, doesn't require constant maintenance, and, unlike a seawall, actively grows and strengthens itself over time as more oysters settle and build upon what's already there. None of this happened by accident, and it didn't happen through a single organization acting alone. Florida's oyster shell recycling and reef restoration effort relied on a sprawling network of partners. Restaurants agreeing to separate and set aside their shell waste instead of tossing it in the trash. Seafood processing plants doing the same at a much larger scale. Nonprofit organizations coordinating collection and curing logistics. University researchers monitoring outcomes and refining techniques, and federal agencies like NOAA providing funding and technical support. NOAA alone has partnered with 5 separate oyster shell recycling programs across the Gulf, which, combined, have returned millions of tons of shell to coastal waters over the years. Florida's contribution, over 500,000 tons across nearly 2 decades, represents one of the largest sustained efforts within that broader regional push. The process of curing the shell before it goes back into the water is worth understanding, because it's part of what makes this approach viable rather than reckless. Freshly discarded shell still carries tissue remnants and bacteria that, if dumped directly into sensitive waters, could contribute to pollution rather than solving it. Instead, collected shell is typically stockpiled in open-air lots for months at a time, exposed to sun, rain, and air. This curing period breaks down remaining organic material and kills off pathogens, leaving behind clean, inert calcium carbonate shell that's ready to serve as a stable, safe substrate. Only after this curing process is the shell transported and deployed at restoration sites, chosen specifically because they correspond to locations where historic reef once thrived before disease, dredging, or overharvesting wiped it out. Choosing the right location matters enormously. Reef restoration isn't as simple as dumping shell anywhere convenient. Water salinity has to fall within a range that supports oyster growth, since too much freshwater intrusion, or alternately, water that's too saline, can both be lethal to developing spat. Water depth affects light penetration and predator access. Current patterns influence how larvae are delivered to a site, and how sediment might bury or expose the new reef over time. Researchers and restoration coordinators spent years mapping out historic reef footprints, using old survey data, aerial imagery, and sediment analysis to identify exactly where shell should be placed to maximize the odds of successful colonization. The results, compounded over almost 2 decades, transformed sections of seafloor that had been essentially dead zones back into living, 3-dimensional reef systems. Not instantly, not without setbacks. Storms occasionally shifted or buried newly placed shell before colonization could take hold, requiring additional deposits. Disease outbreaks in some years slowed oyster growth rates. Funding gaps occasionally paused collection efforts. But the project's sheer duration, sustained collection and placement year after year from 2007 through 2024, gave the ecosystem the one thing restoration efforts often lack: enough time for slow, compounding biological processes to actually take hold and reinforce themselves. What makes this story resonate beyond Florida is what it demonstrates about restoration more broadly. It didn't require inventing new technology. It didn't require synthetic materials engineered in a lab. It required identifying a natural material that was already being thrown away in massive quantities, understanding the precise ecological role that material could still play, and organizing the human systems, collection routes, curing yards, transport logistics, funding streams needed to get it back where it belonged. The oysters did the rest. Bacteria formed the biofilm. Larvae found the surface they were built to seek out. Filtration cleared the water. Structure attracted fish. Fish attracted larger predators. Each step followed naturally from the one before it. Once the missing piece, shell, was returned to the system. The success in Florida has already rippled outward. Similar shell recycling and reef restoration programs have expanded across the Gulf Coast, from Louisiana to Alabama to Texas, each adapting the same basic model to local conditions. Beyond the Gulf, coastal restoration groups in other parts of the world have taken notice, exploring whether the same approach, recycling shell waste back into degraded marine environments, could help rebuild reef systems damaged by pollution, overharvesting, or development in entirely different regions. The underlying principle travels well. Wherever oyster reefs have collapsed due to a lack of hard substrate, and wherever a steady supply of shell waste already exists and is currently being landfilled, there's potential for the same slow, unglamorous, remarkably effective process to play out. There's something worth sitting with in how undramatic this restoration actually looked while it was happening. There was no single dramatic moment, no ribbon cutting, no single before and after photo capturing an instant transformation. It was trucks and barges, month after month, year after year, moving shell from restaurant dumpsters to curing yards to the seafloor. It was researchers diving down to check settlement rates, cataloging slow, incremental increases in oyster density. It was fishermen noticing gradually that certain areas seemed to be producing more fish than they had in years. It was the kind of change that's nearly invisible on any given week, and only becomes undeniable when you compare a decade's worth of data against what came before. By the time researchers and conservationists stepped back to look at the cumulative results, the numbers told a story that critics of the original plan hadn't anticipated. Reefs that had been reduced to bare, shell-starved mud had become dense, structurally complex habitat again. Fish and invertebrate populations tied to that structure had rebounded to levels not seen in decades. Water clarity in several restoration zones had measurably improved, aided by the filtering capacity of the newly established oyster populations. And the shoreline itself, in areas adjacent to restored reef, showed evidence of reduced erosion, a direct result of the wave energy dampening that mature reef structure provides. What started as 500,000 tons of something most people would have called garbage had become, quite literally, the foundation of a living, self-sustaining ecosystem, not built by engineers pouring concrete or divers hand-placing individual structures, but assembled by the ocean itself, using raw material that had been thrown away for decades, once that material was finally put back where it was always meant to be. The story of Florida's oyster shells is, in the end, a story about overlooked value. About how something as ordinary as restaurant waste, treated for generations as a disposal problem, turned out to hold the exact missing piece an entire coastal ecosystem needed to heal itself. It's a reminder that restoration doesn't always require inventing something new. Sometimes it requires recognizing what's already been thrown away, understanding why it matters, and having the patience to put it back, one truckload at a time, and then waiting for years, while the ocean does what it has always known how to do.